Thank you for attending our series of Camera on Campus online conversations. My name is Aviva Rosenshine, and I'm Camera's International Campus Director. We are excited to have all of you here participating in today's conversation titled In Defense of the Truth, a conversation with Ambassador Mark Regev. It's exciting to have so many Israel student activists joining us today from around the world. We have representation here from Israel, the UK, South Africa, the US, and Canada. In a moment, I'll be introducing our guests. Before I do so, I would like to tell you about Camera and Camera on Campus. Camera is a nonpartisan international media research organization. We aim to correct inaccurate information presented in the media to ensure that the public is receiving a correct representation of Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the campus department, we focus on correcting misinformation that may appear in university newspapers, classroom syllabi, or by invited guest speakers. And we provide assistance to students through our two programs, the Camera Fellowship and the Camera on Campus Coalition. The Camera Fellows across the US, Canada, the UK, and Israel focus on monitoring their campus environment, correcting falsehoods when disseminated, and proactively educating their peers about Israel via penning articles, hosting educational events and workshops, and by distributing thoroughly sourced infographics and other resources within the campus quad and online via social media. In addition to the fellowship, Camera's On-Campus Coalition supports independent student-led Israel organizations aiming to help empower the students to be the voice on their respective campuses when it comes to Israel. Each summer, students from both programs attend our international training conference. For this summer, we'll be running a virtual conference for the students. We are currently accepting applications for the Camera Fellowship, and we will send the link out in a follow-up email, as well as a registration link for our June 3rd event, where we will hear about the experiences of confronting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus from several of our current Camera Fellows. At this time, please make yourself aware of the Zoom functions at the bottom of your screen. To get things started, please introduce yourself in the chat box with your name and location from where you are joining us and the university you attend. We'll be using the Q&A function to take questions. Questions will be answered after our moderator and the ambassador have finished their conversation, but feel free to place your questions throughout the talk as they come up. I'm now glad to introduce our guest speakers. Matanya Harrow, Camera Fellow at Hebrew University in Israel, will be moderating today's conversation. Matanya is majoring in economics and international relations and is very involved in the spheres of Israel activism and Israel diaspora relations. In addition to being a Camera Fellow, he serves as a treasurer for the World Union of Jewish Students, is the master of API's Jerusalem chapter, and a member of the advisory board for Meet the Israelis. We are honored to have Israel's ambassador to the UK, Mark Regev, join us for an important and timely discussion about defending Israel in the face of lies, misinformation, biases, and inaccuracies. A longtime diplomat with decades of experience in the foreign affairs apparatus and challenging interviews by the international press, Ambassador Regev is among the most versatile and prolific Israeli diplomats in recent decades. A member of the Ichud Habonim youth movement and of Melbourne University's Jewish Student Society, while pursuing his bachelor's degree, Ambassador Regev evolved from a young activist to a leader in the fight for the truth about Israel. The ambassador has also witnessed firsthand the struggle of pro-Israel campus activists when students at Queen's University Belfast protested his speech and a lecture of his at the University of London was cancelled out of security concerns. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Mark Regev and Matanya Harrow, and enjoy today's conversation.
Thank you, Aviva, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for taking time from your, I'm sure, very busy schedule to join us. The coronavirus may have, put us all in lockdown, but it's helped us internalize the fact that geography may not matter as much anymore, so we can really have participation from all over the globe, which is fantastic. So with that, let me just jump right in. Before serving as Israel's ambassador to the UK, as Aviva mentioned, you were the spokesperson for various different governmental bodies, including the Prime Minister's office, making you possibly one of the most recognized spokespeople for Israel in English. And I'm sure, with that said, you've had plenty of hostile interviews where full disclosure, this one is not going to be, but where the interviewer's basic questions derive from a skewed understanding of Israel and of the situation. And so I would like to ask you how you deal with situations like that. Okay, I'm having trouble hearing you. I don't know if everybody is.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, now I can hear you. Absolutely. Fantastic.
Very good. I'm sorry for the technical lapse there. In democratic societies, and as you know better than most, Israel is a democratic society. It's the job of the media to ask difficult questions. And so I always had the expectation that when you go to an interview, you will be asked challenging questions, because that's why you're there. And the truth is, if the questions were easy the whole time, you wouldn't need anyone with special experience or special knowledge to do the job. Anyone could do the job. The job of the media is to ask difficult questions. And the job of the international media is to ask difficult questions of Israeli spokesperson. That's what they get paid to do. The only thing that I would ask them to do is they should be equal opportunity, difficult question askers. Because one of my criticisms of the way the international media has covered our conflict with the Palestinians is that there's a fundamental institutional bias against Israel, and I'll explain that. Israel is a democracy, it is a free society, and people can say whatever they want. So I would speak for the government of Israel, and then a member of Knesset would give a different attitude because he represents himself and his party, or herself and her party, and then you can have an academic that can say whatever they want, and an NGO can say whatever they want, and maybe the courts would decide something for or against the government. Israel is there every day in our pluralist, in our very open way, and you'll get different opinions. And so if you're a journalist working in Israel, and let's say you walk down the street, let's say in Jerusalem with your camera, and you ask people, what do you think about the Israeli government? And you ask 10 different Israelis randomly, how many different answers will you get?
12.
Maybe 12, because Israelis are particularly opinionated, yes, but you'll get a whole cacophony of different approaches, yes? Then that same correspondent goes to Gaza. And you walk down the street in the Gaza and you say, what do you think about Hamas? And the camera is rolling. And it's much, much more difficult to get someone to say something that's critical. Now, you can presume that Hamas is universally popular, that everyone loves Hamas, or you can presume there are some structural and institutional factors that prevent people giving criticism. And that is, of course, because Hamas is an authoritarian terrorist organization, doesn't take lightly when people criticize them. And it's not just that you have an authoritarian regime and that the civilian population is less likely to speak out, but you also have a situation where you have NGOs, one after another, which will automatically parrot the official line. I remember in the last war in Gaza, yes, you had, we had as Israel, we had specific information that Hamas, not just information, knowledge, that Hamas was using the basement of a hospital to conduct its terrorist activities. And doctors knew about it, but of course none of them could say anything publicly, because if a doctor would say something like that publicly to a Western journalist, not only might they lose their job, but who knows what would happen to them and their families. And so I think there's a fundamental imbalance when you have a democratic, tolerant, pluralistic society in conflict against an authoritarian society. It's up to the journalists to work that much harder on the authoritarian side to get to the news.
But don't they usually, you would assume that these journalists who come from liberal societies themselves, that they would maybe even naturally gravitate towards the society in Israel. And sometimes, I know at least as an Israeli, we feel the opposite, that there's a special hostility against us.
So then you get to what are the other issues? If I, let's say, come to Israel as a correspondent from a country that's got a colonial history, yes? And I view the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians through that colonial prism. So it doesn't matter what the Israelis do, they're colonialists and they shouldn't be there, correct? In other words, everyone who comes to cover the conflict does it their own cultural experience through their country's own history. And obviously our conflict with our Arab neighbors is complex. Thousands of books, more, yes, have been written. How many millions of words, yes? And people come and they will extrapolate from their own experience on the conflict, and often, yes, that can be at Israel's detriment.
Right, absolutely. Well, so that type of hostility isn't only found though in the media. You know, as part of Camera on Campus, one of the places that we work hard to fight it is on campuses, and you've had your own experiences in that area. So, what do you think makes campuses, though, this special hothouse, possibly more than any other place, for this type of anti-Israel hostility to such a sometimes violent degree?
So, it's a good question. And I'm not sure I have a fantastic, all-encompassing answer. I think, let's be clear, you don't want to overstate the point. In other words, it's the anti-Israel activists, those who are hardcore hostile, are a minority, even a small minority, but they are very vocal and they are very active and they are very committed to their cause. And they can give the impression that the whole university believes that way, but I don't believe in most cases that's the case whatsoever. It's a group of activists who hate Israel and often hate Jews. Let's be clear about that. And that they manage to dominate the discussion because the other people are apathetic. But that's also the good news, because if it's just a small group of organized anti-Israel activists, they can be countered by a dedicated group of pro-Israel activists, people who stand up for Israel. And one of the reasons I always was honored to be the Israeli government spokesman and now to be the ambassador of Israel in the United Kingdom is that ultimately I believe in the essential justice of Israel's cause. I know that we're not perfect. Perfection is not on this planet. Yes, perfection is in the next world if you believe in it. But I believe that the essential cause of Israel, Zionism, is just. And that way, it was always my privilege and my honor to stand up for Israel. And people who do that on campus, like your group, like other groups, they are doing the right thing. Because the truth is, the people who are hostile to Israel, the people who hate Israel, are very, very active. And if we don't stand up, and if people who don't stand up for the truth, don't stand up for Israel, are not making their case, so the other side has a monopoly. And it's crucial that pro-Israel students act and speak proudly for Israel.
So we're very aware of this situation on campuses outside of Israel, but just last week we had an incident at my university, at the Hebrew University, where one of the political groups on campus put out a video essentially demonizing the soldiers that study with us on campus. The Army has some programs where students, they're wearing uniforms, but they're studying with us on campus. And, just including pictures of soldiers without their consent and publicizing them in a very negative light. So I would like to ask you if you think that here in Israel, we also have to deal with this in the same way, or is the problem on the Israeli campuses maybe slightly different and doesn't fit into that same rubric?
I'd say probably it's different in Israel, because in Israel, people live in the country and they know it firsthand. You don't have to start explaining to them that Israel's a democracy. People know Israel's a democracy, yes? But I think this is a fundamental difference. Let's be clear here. If you are a student and you want to do independent research and you want to, let's say you're in political science and you want to write about the history of the leader of your country or so forth, Israel's the only country, I think, in the whole greater Middle East that has actually free, open, academic institutions. Let's be clear about that, yes? Which, if I was a doctoral student in political science and I want to write a thesis saying that I believe the Prime Minister is terrible or the Prime Minister, I've got no problem doing that. But I would maybe even in some circles be encouraged to do that. The point being is, can you do that? Can you do that in any of the other universities in the Middle East? Of course, you could write a thesis saying the Israeli Prime Minister is a flawed personality. Yes, but could you write about your own leadership? And the truth is, in the overwhelming majority of cases of academic institutions in the Middle East, that is impossible, because they don't have free free academic freedom the way we have in Israel and we have in democratic countries. And I, as an Israeli, am incredibly proud of that we are a free society. If you think about it, think of that broad map of the Middle East, yes? From Morocco on the Atlantic shore in the west, and you run all the way through to Iraq on the border with Central Asia. And you have, I don't know, 20, 30 countries. You have a couple of 100 million people. In that whole massive piece of geography, yes, from the Atlantic through to Central Asia, there's only one country that really has free academic institutions. There's only one country with an independent judiciary. There's only one country where there is rule of law. There's only one country that has free, democratic, and competitive elections. There's only one country with a free trade union movement. There's only one country with a free and vibrant press. And I think as Israelis, we can be proud of that.
Right. I personally think that also is one of the roots of the frustration that we feel when we are demonized vehemently around the world, is that we really are this unique island in the Middle East, and yet we also get special attention in the other way. But that aside, I want to maybe ask you a couple more personal questions in the sense that being a diplomat, and I'm sure being an Israeli diplomat, definitely to a European country, I don't think anybody would claim your job is easy. And what I would like to know is what drives you? What gets you up in the morning, so to speak?
So I passionately believe in the justice of Israel's cause. And I'm very proud to represent Israel. Being an Israeli diplomat for me isn't a job, it's a vocation. It's something that it's part of me, yes? And I think it goes back to my family history. My father was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was born in 1931 in Magdeburg, Germany. And his generation knew what it was like for Jewish people before there was an independent Jewish state. Let's be clear. I'll ask you this question with your permission. Imagine for a moment that Israel had achieved independence not in 1948, but in 1938. And was imagine for a moment that the British mandate would have ended 10 years earlier. Just 10 years. In historic terms, 10 years is nothing. 10 years is a drop in the bucket in the story of nations, yes? So just think for a moment, and here's my question to you. How many people could we have saved had the mandate ended and Israel achieved independence in May 1938 instead of 10 years later? We have to remember what it was like for Jews, like my own family in Europe. They were trapped. The doors of most countries were closed. They wanted to get out. No one would take them. And if people were willing to take just small amounts, there was no solution to the Jewish people. Had Israel been established, I believe, 10 years earlier, how many Jews could have been saved? How many Jews? Maybe not everybody. Maybe there wouldn't have been the capacity, but there's no doubt that we could have saved many, many, many Jews. And that is the whole justice of Zionism. What was it like for the Jewish people when we were stateless? What was it like when we were defenseless? What was it like when we were always reacting to people persecuting us? Is it not time that we stand up and say, we're proud that the Jewish people now have a state. We're proud that we're sovereign. We're proud that we can defend ourselves if we need to against those that would do us harm. You know, in Britain here, over the last few years, the whole issue of anti-Semitism has been in the public discourse. And people thought that's crazy. Who would have thought that in Britain in the 21st century, there'd be a whole discussion about anti-Semitism, but unfortunately we saw the phenomenon re-emerge here over the last few years. And so some people said to me, look, this is terrible. It appears some things don't change. Yes, anti-Semitism, which we thought should have been thrown on the ash heap of history with all the other rubbish where it deserves to be. Why is it so vibrant? Why is it living on? And they say, look, some things don't change. I'll tell you what has changed. The Jewish people have changed. We've changed. Today, we're no longer defenseless. We can defend ourselves. We're no longer stateless. We have a sovereign state and are independent. That's the change. That's the difference between my generation and my father's generation.
Very, very powerful. And I know just personally, that's when I, serving in the army, that's what led the way, that historical significance. You mentioned kind of the UK also and Israel relations. So we haven't had, this year, I believe we're celebrating 70 years of Israeli and UK relations, but it hasn't always been smooth sailing. You know, the Balfour Declaration was great, but then during the partition plan, they abstained. So what do you see in the future of our diplomatic relations, especially if you could talk a little bit about the recent happenings with the deal of the century and the reaction of the UK essentially leading the European charge against it.
So you're right in the premise of your question that Israel-UK relations got off to a very difficult start, because when Israel declared their independence, I'd even say relations were particularly strained. We in Israel, many people, blamed the British for the white paper, for the Jews being trapped in Europe, for closing the borders to the homeland, and inadvertently, indirectly, forcing the Jews to be trapped in Europe and therefore becoming victims of the Nazis. There was at the time, there was anger amongst Jews about the way the British behaved. Now, we knew that Churchill stood alone. We knew that they were crucial in the struggle against Hitler and all that. But the fact that they were appeasing radical Arab opinion and they closed the borders to the historic homeland and they didn't allow Jews in, and the Jews that weren't allowed in were trapped in Europe, yes, that created, let's be clear, there was an anger, especially since the British were in mandatory Palestine. They only got the mandate because of their commitments to the League of Nations, that they were there to establish a national home for the Jewish people. And so it was the British weren't living up to their commitments, not just to the Jews, but their commitments to the League of Nations, to the organized international community, by reneging on the Jewish national home. Then you add to that, when Israel was attacked immediately after our independence, Ben-Gurion declares Israel's independence on a Friday afternoon in May 1948. That very night, the Egyptian Air Force bombs Tel Aviv, and the next day, all the neighboring countries invade to try to destroy the newborn Jewish state. From the north, the Lebanese and the Syrians; from the east, the Transjordan at the time and Iraq; and from the south, the Egyptians. Now, we knew at the time that some of those armies were armed by British weapons, with British weapons. And some of them were commanded by British officers, the armies that invaded. And so there was a difficult period in UK-Israel relations. Let's be fair, in Britain, they weren't too happy that members of the underground in Israel were conducting a violent struggle to end the British mandate, yes? And so there was difficult feelings on both sides, I know that. But from our point of view as Jews, they let the side down. They had not helped us when the Jewish people needed them most. And they had reneged on their historic commitment, as I said, to us and to the League of Nations to help facilitate a Jewish national home. Fast forward, I'm glad to tell you today, to report, that UK-Israel relations are in a much better situation. Yes, we've gone from strength to strength. Today, if you look at any aspect of the relationship, we're in a very healthy place. I'll give you just some examples. Trade. We do very well in trade. You know, our largest trading partner on the planet is the United States of America. And number two last year was Britain. I mean, we sell and trade more with Britain than we do with Italy or with Germany or with France. It's our most important market. There's one statistic that I like particularly. They say 1 in 7 medicines that are prescribed through the British National Health Service, and they have one huge system here in Britain, are Israeli pharmaceuticals. And that's one example. On the security side, we work very closely with the British, whether it's military to military, counterterrorism to counterterrorism, intelligence communities to intelligence communities, very strong relationships that keep the peoples of both our democracies safe. Very important relationship. We had in 2018, the first time ever, we had a first official royal visit when Prince William came to Israel. And I remembered at the time, people were very excited in Israel. We haven't, as you know better than most, we haven't had royalty amongst Jews since biblical times. Yes, there have not been kings and queens of Israel since the Bible. And when Prince William came, it was very exciting. And it was also a sign that the relationship had moved on because, as you probably know, for many years, the royal family would visit at various countries in the neighborhood, but it never worked out that they could visit us. And that happened in 2018. So I think we can appreciate the good relationship today, precisely because we know it wasn't always that way. And I actually hope to see in the coming years the UK-Israel relationship going from strength to strength.
And in response really to the question of applying Israeli law to portions of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and kind of the outcry that we're hearing, how do you feel that is going to affect the relationship at large? And do you think should Israel go through with this plan, what do you think the reaction will be?
So on this issue, the British have publicly expressed a position that is negative. They've called on Israel not to do so. But that's another example. I'll give you when the Americans moved their embassy to Jerusalem and recognized Jerusalem as our capital, the British were also not supportive of that. When the Americans declared that the Golan Heights is part of Israel, the British were not supportive of that either. When the Americans pulled out of the JCPOA, the terrible nuclear agreement with the Iranians, the British were not supportive of that either. So in the framework of friendship, we have some disagreements, but I suppose that's natural. Even the best of friends can't agree on everything. Obviously, I'd like the British, to move more to our positions, and I hope eventually they will. I mean, I always, when I meet British officials, I sometimes remind them, I say, when are you actually going to move your embassy to Jerusalem where it should belong? And the truth is, I think it's wrong that the British embassy is not in Jerusalem. It should be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is our capital. It's been the capital of the Jewish people since biblical times, and it's been the capital of the modern state of Israel since the establishment of the state. And you know, there's a norm in international relations, and that norm is that every country gets to choose its own capital, and the international community respects that choice. That's a norm that's applied across the board. We've even had examples of countries that have changed their capital cities. The Turks, after the revolution, after Ataturk's revolution, they moved their capital city from Istanbul to Ankara. No one keeps embassies in Istanbul. Everyone accepts it's the right of the Turkish people and the Turkish state to choose where its capital city will be. The Chinese, after their revolution, moved their embassy from their capital from Nanjing to Beijing, and people recognized that and accepted that. The Germans, the capital of the Federal Republic was for decades Bonn. And after unification, and even people like Mrs. Thatcher in this country who weren't so happy about German unification, yes, there was never any doubt that if the Germans moved their capital, we will recognize Berlin as their capital. This is a norm in international relations that's applied across the board, except to Israel. So I hope to see many countries, including the United Kingdom, also move their embassy to Jerusalem.
God willing. So we're going to move now to some questions from the audience. I have a couple here. The first one is, Your Excellency, the quarantine period has felt like a Zoom farewell tour as your tenure comes to an end. Many of us have had the privilege of hearing many of your speeches from the supremacy of Israeli cows to 7 facts for 7 decades. In reflecting on your time in London, can you tell us some of your favorite talks you've given and most memorable moments since becoming ambassador to the Court of St. James? I would add to that, can you just share with us what you feel in general was your greatest success in your tenure?
So I'd point to a few things. There were high points and there were low points. You've asked me about the high points. So there's no doubt that first royal visit was a high point, because a royal visit is symbolic. And it was symbolic of the place the relationship had reached. And remember, as I said before, there were many years when the royal family did not have time to visit Israel. And once again, they visited our neighbors. Maybe it's easier for them to visit some of our neighbors because royalty can host royalty, and some of our neighbors have royal families too. And Israel, of course, we don't, but it was good. That definitely was a high point. The centenary in November 2017, we celebrated 100 years to the Balfour Declaration. And that was done here in London in a wonderful way. They invited Prime Minister Netanyahu as official guest of the British government, and Mrs. May, and they had meetings, and then we had this event together hosted by Lord Rothschild, who, as you know, his ancestor was the recipient of the famous letter. It says, "Dear Rothschild," and it was a wonderful event. And that definitely also was a high point, especially as since there was a certain amount of pressure on the British not to celebrate the centenary of Balfour. And they nevertheless, at the time, the Prime Minister May, Foreign Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, decided, no, we're doing this event. And that was a very good thing. They're two of the highlights I have.
Very, very powerful highlights. I remember Netanyahu's speech from that event. It's once again, as you mentioned before, it brings up the historical importance, where people rooted in history, and it's incredibly powerful. Okay, so let me read another one. Hi, my name is Angad Kahana. I hope I pronounced that correctly, and I'm from India. I wish to know, how does Israel tend to accurately represent their perspective on the conflict with Palestine, despite the demonized bias against Israel by the international media? You touched on this in a certain way. I don't know if you want to expand on it.
So I'll say something needs to be said. We celebrated very recently Israel's 72nd Independence Day. And we celebrated that strangely this year because we were on lockdown because of coronavirus, yes? Normally we would have barbecues and we would have parties and people get together, family and friends, and there are all these huge big ceremonies. Independence is generally an authentic fun day in Israel. Yom Ha'atzmaut is a day that people celebrate and enjoy. And the Palestinians, they, Absolutely. On the same day, and it's not the same day because they use a different calendar, yes? We do go to the Hebrew calendar and they choose the English calendar, but they commemorate what they call, their word, the Nakba, which is the catastrophe. And I always say to Palestinians, I say to them, Israel just celebrated 72 years of independence. Why are you not celebrating 72 years to an independent Palestine? Because ultimately, the UN in November 1947, the UN passed a resolution that called for 2 states for 2 peoples. The UN said that there'll be a Jewish state, the UN's words, a state for the Jews and a state for the Palestinian Arabs. And there are newsreels, black and white newsreels you can see from Tel Aviv at the time. And the Israelis are glued to their radios because at the time there's obviously no television and there's no internet, and they're glued to their radios and they're writing down. And the minute there's a 2/3 majority, and you needed a 2/3 majority for the resolution to be passed, there's a spontaneous celebration in Tel Aviv. And people go out and they dance. Yes, the United Nations, let's be clear, we were not happy necessarily with the borders of the partition plan. But the concept that a small Jewish state was better than no Jewish state and that we were willing for a historic compromise to get our freedom, yes, the Jewish community embraced partition. The Palestinian leadership said no. They said all or nothing. And they encouraged the Arab world to launch an attack to try to destroy Israel at birth. We spoke about that a moment ago. When you say all or nothing, when you choose conflict, you can end up with nothing. So whose fault is it that we're not celebrating 72 years since the birth of an independent Palestine? My fault? Israel's fault? Maybe a bit of self-criticism on the Palestinian side is warranted if they want to have a serious discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, let me ask the next one. What advice can you give the students listening now who want to pursue a career representing Israel on the international stage from both inside and outside the government apparatus?
So I'd be careful of giving advice because I'm probably doing this job too long. But I can say the following. Number one, if you want to be an effective advocate for Israel, you have to know your stuff, right? It's not just enough to have a piece of paper with some sound bites. It won't work. You have to know your stuff. So people who want to be serious, effective ambassadors for Israel, advocates for Israel, you have to know your material. That's why groups like CAMA are so important, because you educate your people, yes? It's important to read the books, to read the newspapers, to know your facts. Often, the side that is most critical of Israel just knows a few slogans. They don't know the facts. Like when I told that before about 1947, that Palestinians rejecting statehood, a lot of them have never even heard of that, but it's a historic fact, yes? You have to know your material. The most important thing is to know your facts. If you know your facts, that makes you a much more effective advocate for Israel.
You demonstrated when you said before that after the partition plan that people in Tel Aviv went out to party. That's because in Jerusalem, and you were very careful, I noticed, to mention Tel Aviv. In Jerusalem, I know my grandfather was born in Berlin, but he grew up in Jerusalem. He told me when they were listening to the radio and they heard that, they knew what was coming next. They knew what the war was coming. And so actually in Jerusalem, they didn't go out to the streets to party. But
though I do know that outside the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, which is in the same place that it is now, there was a celebration. And there's a famous story of Ben Gurion, who looked at them celebrating, and just like your grandfather said, he looked at the people celebrating and he wasn't smiling. And people said to Ben Gurion, listen, you're a Zionist, all your life you've been fighting for Jewish independence. It's finally been recognized by the United Nations. Why are you not celebrating too? And he said exactly what you said. He said he knew that many of the young people who were celebrating could well fall in battle to defend the Jewish state. He knew that we were about to be attacked. You know, there's an interesting story. The American Secretary of State at the time, Marshall, sent messages to Ben Gurion, to the leadership, that they should not declare independence. And we should put it off, we should wait. And their logic was as such: you will declare independence, you will immediately be attacked by your neighbors, you are outnumbered, you are outgunned, we're not coming to defend you, you won't survive, don't do it. That was the message. Now, of course, he was half right. We declared independence, and it's true, we were attacked immediately, and we were outgunned and outnumbered. I mean, as I said, we were one small, recently, a day-old country, yes, without the institutions of a country. And we were attacked by all the neighboring countries, as I said before, from the north by the countries of Lebanon and Syria, from the east, Jordan and Iraq, and from the south by Egypt. All of them attacked us on the next day. But where the Americans were wrong is we prevailed. And the truth is, and this is ultimately why Israel's story is a story of success, because not only did we prevail, we didn't just survive. Israel succeeded. Israel flourished. Look at what we have today. We spoke about Israeli democracy before, yes? But one of the fastest growing economies in the OECD, consistently over the last decade. A country which is an epicenter for creativity on the planet, whether it's scientific creativity in the framework of all that high tech we produce, on the cutting edge of so much technological development, or whether it's artistic creativity. I live here in London. I go to my cable TV. Do you know how many Israeli programs are on television here in London? We're producing culture that the whole world is watching. And I'm not just talking about our Wonder Woman Gal Gadot. Yes, I'm talking about in cinema and in television. Israel is a powerhouse of creativity. And I actually believe, if you consider where we were 72 years ago and where we are today, I think we're going to be even more successful in the next 72 years. Why? Because Israel is uniquely positioned to succeed in the 21st century, because what we do well is what is important in the 21st century. Creativity, technology, innovation, all the things that Israel excels in is one of the most important facets to succeed in this new century. So I'm confident about Israel's future as we move into our second 72 years. And one more reason, which we haven't talked about why I'm optimistic, is our new relations with the Arab countries. Let's be clear. Today, Israel is talking to more Arab governments than ever before in the history of the Jewish state. We've had peace with Egypt for more than 40 years, with Jordan for decades. And now we're talking to countries across the Gulf and in Northern Africa, countries that in the past saw Israel as an enemy, in the past were hostile to Israel, and today they see Israel as a friend, as a partner, even as an ally. It's very, very exciting. So if I'm upbeat about Israeli technology, if I'm upbeat about our relations with the Arab countries, can I not be upbeat about Israel's future?
Yeah, very, very good points. Although some of the other countries that historically Israel has had good relations with, we do see an uptick in anti-Semitism. Just to bring the UK, it was no secret that in the last elections there was a lot of fear of a Labour victory. How do you feel that the UK or the Labour Party is going to be able to contend with that upsurge?
So you should know that the Labour Party in Britain has a history of supporting Israel. Harold Wilson, Labour Prime Minister, great friend of Israel. James Callaghan, Labour Prime Minister, great friend of Israel. Tony Blair, Labour Prime Minister, great friend of Israel. Gordon Brown, Labour Prime Minister, great friend of Israel. We now have a new leadership of the Labour Party in Britain. I hope that they will return to that moral position of showing solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people.
Definitely something worth hoping for. So in that same sense, though, as one of the questions, one of the askers mentioned, your tenure as the UK ambassador is coming to a close. What do you think is the biggest challenge for your successor?
Well, I'm not sure I should give public advice to whoever comes to replace me, but I would say this. We spoke about it before. Moving the embassy, right? Now, it might not happen tomorrow. The British position seems to be pretty tough, yes? But we shouldn't give up. We should keep making our case. We know that justice is on our side, and it will happen. We hope sooner rather than later.
Definitely. As you mentioned a couple of times, there's a deep relationship between, going back historically, between the UK and Israel. Just in Barbara Tuchman's book, The Bible and Sword, I've read it.
I've read
it. Part of it, but yeah, that's very much what it's about. She has some other fantastic books like The Guns of August that I've loved. Different topic. One more question. Okay, Mr. Ambassador, you said recently in an interview with Rabbi Friedman from the suburbs that Israel will open the sky to some countries soon, but the UK will not likely be on this list. Could you elaborate on this, please? And if, as Netanyahu states, the priority of this new government is to avoid a second wave, will the skies ever be open in the UK in the near future?
So we've been relatively successful in Israel, as you know, to keeping coronavirus casualties relatively low. Now, obviously, everyone who's died is a tragedy, yes? Part of Jewish tradition is if you save a life, it's like if you've saved the whole world, and if someone dies, it's terrible. And for every one of our 280 casualties, it's a whole world lost, yes? But in macro terms, we have been very successful in Israel in keeping our death figures very, very low. And that is precisely because we've been very rigorous from the very beginning. I'll tell you a story. My counterpart in Seoul, South Korea, I think it was in late February, he was called into the Korean Foreign Ministry and given what we call in diplomatic terms, a talking to, yes? They said to him, we are friendly countries. South Korea and Israel trade together. We have defense cooperation. We've got a good relationship. The South Koreans were offended because they were upset. They said, you've stopped flights from Seoul to Tel Aviv. This isn't, we're good friends, and this is not the way friends should act with each other. I think a bit later they understood why we did it. And of course, a lot of other countries closed their air routes to hot ops, but Israel was first off the mark, or one of the first off the mark. And I think that's because in Israel, maybe we're better used to dealing with a crisis because of the national security challenges. Maybe our government decision-making process is more efficient. Maybe we had good leadership who saw that this was important, but we've kept the numbers of casualties very, very, very low. And now we feel we can open up. And so as a first stage, we're going to open up, apparently, no decisions are taken yet, but the thinking is we're going to open up more to countries which, like us, have the disease behind them. We've got to do it carefully. We've got to do it in a very measured way. We don't want to see, as you said in your question, or sorry, the questioner said, a recurrence of this terrible virus. We want to make sure that we've got on top of it and we're not going to suddenly be irresponsible and see it come back again. We didn't pay this price just to go back to square one. So we're going to have an incremental opening up, very measured, very careful. And when we open the skies, I think at the first stage, it'll be with countries that have, like us, succeeded in really getting this under control. Britain is not there yet. It might take a little longer with Britain. And this is a tragedy. I speak to people here, especially here in the Jewish community. You know, in the past, we had wars, we had crises in Israel, and always the skies were open. We did a wonderful event here in the embassy, I think it was in 2018, or maybe 17. At the time of the Six-Day War, when people thought there was actually a serious threat to Israel's very existence, because the young men and many young women were called up to the front, there was a huge labor shortage in Israel. And literally hundreds of British Jews volunteered, and they went to our kibbutzim and the moshavim, and they picked fruit, and they replaced people who were at the front. And we did a ceremony here at the embassy to celebrate them, and they deserved it. But what I'm trying to say is, even in times of crisis in the past, the country was already open, especially for Jews who wanted to come and help out and show solidarity and so forth. This is the first time we've had a crisis, and we've been forced to close the country down. And I hope that it won't be too long before we can open up the skies for Britain as well. But I think British people understand that we have to be measured. Ultimately, protecting human life has to come first.
So we have time for one more question. For that, I'll pass it over to Eitan Fishberger, our campus coordinator in Israel for camera. I just wanted to really say thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm sure I don't just speak for myself when I say that we're looking forward to see where the next step is and where that drive that has led you up till now brings you next. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I hope everyone hears me. Thank you very much, Matanya. Thank you, Matanya, again for an amazing job moderating. Really well done. And thank you, Mr. Ambassador, again for joining us. I'd just like to echo what Matanya just stated, especially during these times where borders are being closed, maintaining strong diplomatic relations as you've been doing in the UK are more pertinent than ever. So if you don't mind, I would just like to ask one final question, and then I'll make a couple of announcements to our attendees. So I know that you touched upon this briefly in some of the answers, but it's a question that's been nagging me for a while personally. We often hear about the situation on campuses around the world, especially in the West, and how problematic they are vis-a-vis, anti-Israelism, anti-Semitism, and it's sometimes difficult to maintain your optimism in the face of all this. So I'm curious, what do you think? Is the battle for campuses lost, or do we still have some fight left in us? And what can we do to improve our activism?
First of all, it's never lost. On the contrary, I believe that when we've got young people like yourselves who are willing to stand up for Israel and for the justice of Israel's cause, and the other side, as I said before, they're not a majority, they're just a very loud, small group of haters. And if we stand up to them and we are vocal, and we use our knowledge and our creativity, it's not lost at all. There's no reason to be pessimistic. Let's go macro for a moment. If you look at, as I said a moment ago, if you look where Israel was in 1948 and where we are today, is there any possible logical reason for pessimism? On the contrary, there's every reason to be optimistic about Israel's future. Israel is more prosperous than ever before. Israel is stronger than ever before. Our democracy is more vibrant than ever before. Israel has stronger relations with the Arab world than ever before. Israel is an amazing success story, and we should never forget that. Now, it's true that you've got pockets of hatred on different places, and on university campuses, you see it too. So we have to remember that we have to fight the good fight. We have to stand up for Israel. And why is it so important? Let's say I'm a student on some campus here in Britain, right? If pro-Israel students are not speaking up, then I'll be 3-4 years at university and I'll only hear the other side. Think of that. That's why what Israeli pro-Israel activists is so important, because if you're not active, the other side's going to be active anyway. If you're not active, it means a regular student, he or she, will be on campus for 3-4 years doing their degree, and they'll never hear pro-Israel thinking. They'll never hear a pro-Israel message, because the other side will just be saying the opposite. So it's so crucial what you do. And here I want to say how appreciative I am of what you and the other organizations are doing on campus. I know I've known Camera for years, ever since I was, I think, spokesman at our embassy in Washington. And I met the Camera people there for the first time. But that was a long time ago. Maybe some of you weren't even born then. So I've known Camera for a long time, and I want to praise you for what you do, standing up for Israel, and it is greatly, greatly appreciated.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the kind words. And, of course, once again, thank you for everything. I'm just going to make 2 quick announcements and then we'll sign off. At the end of this webinar lecture, after it's done, you'll be receiving an email containing a couple of notices and information. One is about our campus fellowship, our student leadership fellowship. We're active in over 80 campuses worldwide, and we have a year-long fellowship, for those of you who aren't aware, where we really hone the skills of some of the activists on campus, whether it's writing or organizing events. It's very important that we maintain a strong presence, as the ambassador said, on these campuses. So you'll be receiving an email about that. In addition, in the email, you'll have a notification about our June 3rd event, which is occurring exactly, if my math is correct, 1 week from today, which will be featuring 4 of our exceptional Camera on Campus fellows, one in Berkeley, one in King's College London, one in York University in Canada, and one from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Hopefully they're all in attendance right now. And basically, the goal of this upcoming webinar is twofold. One is that we often hear about these anti-Israel, anti-Semitic things that occur on campus, but what some people don't realize is that it's all connected. They're really all stemming from the same feelings, the same deep-seated hatred for Israel and Jewish people. And we would like to show everyone with this panel that it's all connected. So that's the first goal. And the second goal is to really deepen the ties between all of our fellows and all of our activists in various parts of the world. Sometimes it feels like there's a bit of a disconnect between everyone, whether it's because of the time zone or just simply being tens of thousands of miles away from each other. But it's really important that we really deepen the bond and the relationship between all of our fellows. So you'll be receiving an email after this event is over about that. And once again, I would just like to thank, of course, our amazing moderator, Matanya Harrow, for really setting a high bar for future moderators. Of course, our Camera on Campus staff, our International Campus Director, Aviva Rosenshine, Douglas on tech, who is exceptional, and of course, the ambassador himself for participating and his team. Thank you, everyone, very much, and we hope to see you soon, and stay safe.